Have you ever bite into your freshly filled macarons only to get all the fillings ooze out from the sides? Or your macarons were too crunchy, too hard, or maybe too chewy to enjoy them? Well, that's because you need to mature your macarons. Maturing is the process of resting your filled macarons for the period of time so that filling infuses your shells with flavor and softens them. It's very important to mature macarons because on its own, macaron shells are pretty plain. They're only made of simple ingredients, almond flour with meringue basically. And of course you can flavor shells and whatnot, but flavoring shells, it's very limited. And that's why the fillings play the major role of adding the flavors to your macarons. And without maturing your macarons, you won't have that cohesive flavor and texture combination of the final product, and you will be missing out big time. So this is why maturing is so important, and I'm going to share with you 5 tips on maturing your macarons properly. And sometimes you need to expedite the process and whatnot. So I'm going to share all those tips in just a second. But before I share all those tips, I have a special announcement to share. Earlier this year in this video, I shared that I was writing a macaron fillings handbook, and I'm so excited to announce that it's finally available for you to purchase. This book is labor of love. It took me a little longer than I anticipated, but I didn't want to rush the process because I wanted to release something that I'm 100% satisfied with. And finally that time came and my handbook is complete, and I'm so proud of every single page on it. This book is about fillings of macarons, and rather than focusing on different recipes, I want to cover fundamental information on ganaches, buttercreams, fruit confitures, curds, and other fillings like caramel sauce and whatnot. I wanted to share all the knowledge, base knowledge of creating these fillings so that you can create your own flavors based on your own taste. Once you understand the basics and the science behind each technique, you can create your own flavors. The world of flavors will open up in front of you. You're not going to be limited to individual recipes. If you would like to purchase this book, I will put a link down below. Check it out, and I really hope you will get a copy of it. It's an ebook, so nothing will be shipped to you. It will be available to download straight away. So now let's get back to our maturing macarons. Let's start with tip number 1. Maturing time depends on different factors. It can take from 8 hours up to 48 hours, sometimes even longer. It depends on the type of filling you're using for your macarons. Whether fillings like cream cheese filling, or if you're using fruit jams or preserves, your macarons will mature faster because there's so much moisture in the filling, and they will infuse the macaron shells faster. Also depends how your macarons are baked. If they are overbaked and they're extra crunchy, it will take longer time to mature. If you're underbaked your macarons and they're kind of on the softer side, then it will take less time as well. So I like to group the time of the maturing into 3 groups. Straight buttercreams and ganaches takes a longer time to mature. I would say about 24-48 hours for ganache and buttercreams. If you're using buttercream and ganache as a ring and add fruit preserves or jams in the center, then your macarons can mature within 24 hours, like 18 to 24 hours easily. Now, if you're using soft fillings like cream cheese filling, then your macarons can mature faster. You can have your macarons mature within 8 hours or around that time. Again, it depends on how your shells were baked, if they're were extra hard or underbaked, soft and whatnot, but those are general guidelines. I like to mature my macarons in a flat position so that if you have soft fillings and whatnot, they don't ooze out or anything. So I just layer them on an airtight container in flat position, and once they're matured and set, you can stack them up like this. So tip number 2, if you're using fruit jams or like soft fillings like curds on your macarons, if you don't want your macarons to get overly soft and mushy, which you don't want, you can go ahead and very thin smear of buttercream on all over the bottom of the shell, and then pipe your ring and then fill your soft fillings like curds or jams and preserves, and then on both ends. And then once you fill, the buttercream will act as a barrier, buttercream or ganache, and they will act as a barrier. It won't make your shells too mushy. Now, I've seen tips on using chocolate, but with chocolate you need to be careful because you don't want to block the filling entirely, and chocolate tend to do that, creates a block. So I like to use ganache or buttercream instead of straight up chocolate. Tip number 3 is another way of infusing fruit jams or curds into your ganache, but you don't want to smear that buttercream on the bottom, is you can squeeze your buttercream or ganache into a like dollop on the shell, and then squeeze your jam straight into your ganache inside. That way your wet fillings doesn't get in touch with your macarons directly, and that will slow down the maturing process as well, and won't make your macarons too wet. Especially if you're going to freeze your macarons, those wet fillings tend to make your macarons extra soft. Since we are talking about the fruit jams and whatnot, I want to mention that I don't like to use fruit jams or preserves because they are so sweet, and macarons are already so sweet, and instead I like to use fruit confiture. It's a little bit different process, and I wrote about it in my book, so shameless plug, I gotta say that. And tip number 4, in the completely opposite scenario where you are using buttercream or ganache and you accidentally overbaked your macarons and they're like a little extra crunchy and you don't have 48 or 3 days to mature your macarons, you can expedite the process by brushing on a little bit milk on the bottom of the shell before filling on both sides. And be careful with this process too. You don't want to accidentally brush on too much milk and then turn your macarons too mushy. But this will help you to expedite the maturing process, especially if you're using drier fillings like ganache or buttercream. I also have seen people use simple syrup instead of milk. And again, I'm not a fan. You can do that. But the reason I don't like that is because I don't like add extra sweetness to my macarons. They're already sweet. They already have sweet fillings and they're made with lots of sugar. Although my basic macaron recipe has reduced sugar amount, but still there can be sweet. So I don't like to add extra sweetness if I don't have to. And tip number 5 is, if you're planning to freeze your macarons, make sure to mature them first before you freeze them. Yes, you can mature them after you freeze them, but it's easier to mature them and then freeze them. Now you may be wondering, why can't we mature the macarons in the freezer? Well, that's not possible because once you freeze your macarons, they get solid right away and there's no moisture seeping into your macarons and whatnot. So that doesn't work like that. So you have to mature your macarons in the fridge in an airtight container first and then transfer it into your freezer. And here's the bonus tip. Never ever serve or eat macarons straight from the fridge. Cold macarons are not ideal to serve or enjoy because your fillings can be hard and whatnot. If you have frozen macarons, here's the process. Take your frozen macarons, place them in the fridge, ideally overnight, but minimum 5 hours to slowly thaw your frozen macarons in the fridge, and then bring it out on the counter for at least 15 minutes, if not 30 minutes, up to an hour. And then once you try your matured macarons, they're going to be perfect consistency, perfect texture, and it will be so good. Now, if you're thinking like, why can't I bring from the freezer onto the countertop? So due to drastic temperature difference, once your frozen macarons come out on the countertop, they can condensate and get wet and not good. I don't like it. I have a video on my basic macarons, and there's a clip where I was transferring the macarons into clamshells, and in that video the macarons look super glossy, and that's the reason why. For the video purposes, I take them out straight from the freezer and I start filming, and they condensate it and become glossy and sticky and not good. And one more bonus tip here: if you really need to expedite maturing your macarons, this is not ideal. Always plan ahead, but in emergency situations, I've heard people use marshmallows or bread along with your filled macarons in an airtight container. Now, here's the warning: I do not recommend using bread, although it's a fantastic idea for cookies and whatnot, but macarons are known for as naturally gluten-free treat. So you need to be very careful, especially if you're selling or giving it to people with a celiac allergy or for gluten. It can be deadly if you serve them macarons that were in close contact with bread. And even though you're not getting them in contact with macarons, people with celiac disease, they cannot even handle in the close proximity. So be careful with that. I do not recommend using bread for expediting maturing process, but you can use marshmallow. And another trick is to have a wet paper towel, line it on a baking pan, place your filled macarons on top of the cooling rack so that there's like wet environment going around, and then you cover it with a plastic wrap and let it mature for about 10-15 minutes. That will help you to soften your macarons quickly. But ideal way is to wait for a proper amount of time, because maturing is not just softening macarons, right? It's not just softening macarons, it's also flavoring the shells, and you can't rush that process. And here I have some of a few macarons, and they're filled with two of my absolute favorite fillings from my handbook. One is passion fruit milk chocolate ganache, and the other one is apple caramel filling. It's so good, absolutely divine. And I wanted to show you how the properly matured and room temperature macarons should look like. This is a passion fruit milk chocolate ganache. So good. So notice the filling is not oozing out anywhere. It stays in place because it's set, and it's not overly wet because it just gave all the moisture to the shells, and it's become perfectly cohesive confection. Now let's try my apple caramel filling. And this is very stable filling that you don't have to create a well around it. You can find out the secret to it in the handbook. Let's give this a try. This is perfect texture macaron because you want to have that initial eggshell crispness going and then fluffy inside. See how the filling also is not oozing out? It's perfectly in place. So this is what you want in your macarons after maturing and bringing them to room temperature. I really hope you enjoyed this video and get away a tip or two. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. And also, I would really appreciate it if you purchase my handbook. If you like my videos in general, I know you will like my handbook as well, because I go into details. There's no little detail, right? I really hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you next time. Bye!